The American Civil War is a conflict that Tony Blair must be thankful he wasn't around to see, because he'd have exploded with confusion. Someone would have come running into his office shouting, "Prime Minister, America's at war! Who do we support?" Well, you know, America, of course. But America's on both sides, sir. Yeah, well, you know, I mean, God, and, you know, I mean, then... Gordon! The Civil War is usually portrayed as a battle just about territory. Vast books and lengthy television series are dedicated to explaining battle plans and troop formations. But above all else, it was about slavery, and Harriet Tubman did more than almost anybody to abolish it.
Yeah! Go Cannon! Go Cannon!
She had a special incentive to abolish slavery, as she was a slave herself, born onto a plantation in Maryland around 1820. Slaves worked from sunrise to sundown. They couldn't marry without permission from their masters, and the master could choose a partner for the slave. Then, if no slave babies were being produced, the master could replace the woman with a new wife. Women picked cotton while they were feeding their babies, and as soon as children were old enough to work, they could be sold on to a new owner to be parted from their families forever. So it's remarkable there's not more bitterness about the history of slavery. Like, I went to Barbados once, and the only reason these people are there at all is because my ancestors dragged their ancestors across the sea and forced them to pick sugar. But when you get there, they're so friendly. It's like they're going, "Oh, don't worry about that. It was ages ago. Come on, can't keep going on about it. Got to have a laugh." The only confusing thing is that 1/5 of the population is white, and they've got the same accent as black people. So the first night I was in this bar, and a white person come up and said, "Do you want to play pool?" I said, "You what?" He said, "You want game pool?" I said, "You can't take the piss in here, mate. Barbados, you're not in Peckham now." In Maryland, one of the major sources of profit for the slave owners was the breeding and selling on of young slaves. And the owner of one of these plantations was Edward Brodess, and part of his stock was Araminta Tubman, who grew up to take her mother's name of Harriet. When Harriet was 5, she was hired out to Miss Susan, who had asked for a slave girl to look after her baby. If the baby cried, then Harriet was whipped. And one morning...
I was whipped 5 times before breakfast.
At the age of 12, Harriet ran to the defence of another slave as the overseer was after him. Overseers were like plantation line managers, and this one threw a lead weight which hit Harriet. Later, she said,
"Broke my skull and drove a piece of my shawl clean into my head. I was carried to my house and lay bleeding and fainting for 2 days."
As a result of this, for the rest of her life, she had a condition where she would suddenly fall asleep and then wake up sometime later with no idea that any time had passed. Harriet was taken back to her master, and to his credit, he did show some concern, saying,
"Now she ain't worth a sixpence."
Come on, can't defend that. It's not worth sixpence.
Maybe the most damaging effect of this sort of behaviour was how it made the slaves feel themselves about their own worth. You're brought up as stock. If you get injured, the only concern is that now you're damaged property. The result was that Harriet felt ashamed even to eat in front of white people. Slaves felt worthless, so before they could challenge slavery, they had to confront their own lack of self-worth. And a couple of incidents helped this process. In 1839, a slave ship called the Amistad sailed into US waters, the slaves having mutinied and taken control of the ship. The ship was then seized by the US Navy and the slaves held in custody. After a long campaign, the slaves were allowed to return to Africa. Now, this episode was recently made into a Spielberg film in which the slaves tell the president how dreadful their conditions were, and he's horrified and orders their release. The story of the Amistad spread through the plantations, but even more potent was a slave rebellion in 1831, about 100 miles from where Harriet lived, led by Nat Turner. About 60 slave owners were killed, and for a while the rebels took over a whole county, and Nat Turner became a folk legend throughout Maryland and Virginia.
But before you could say Jack Rabbit, Natty Turner had choked the old master to death. The end.
Again.
All right. Come on. You're going to get whipped, said the master.
Then in 1852, a white woman called Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which alerted the North to the brutality of slavery. And one anti-slavery activist in the South was jailed for 10 years for owning a copy. But a new atmosphere had developed, that slavery could be challenged, that it wasn't destined to go on forever. Harriet Tubman's mum, when asked to meet a slave trader who she suspected wanted to buy her children, told him,
You are after my son? But the first person that comes into this house for him, I will split his head open.
And I like to think that that's a charming point in history, where somehow the spirit of a Maryland slave rebellion meets the language of South London. When Harriet was around 20, she met and fell in love with John Tubman, and in 1844 they were given permission to marry.
I now pronounce you man and wife. You may now get back to work!
Oh!
For a while, she prayed that the Lord might change Master Brodess, making him receive Christ and repent and then free her family. But then she found out that he was planning to sell her, parting her from everybody that she knew. And so she said,
I changed my prayer to Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him and take him out of the way.
A few weeks later, Master Brodess died and Harriet felt horribly guilty, though it was hardly her fault, unless the Lord's a high-class hitman. And then, for prayers to work, they'd have to go, Dear Lord, got another job for you. Here's the photo. He comes out of William Hill's every Thursday afternoon at 4:30. I'll sing you half on him now and the rest when the job's done. Soon after this, Harriet took the decision to escape. She couldn't persuade her husband to come with her, so one day she spent all day singing songs about embarking on a journey to the promised land, and the other slaves knew that this was code for her intending to escape.
Gonna crawl through the leaves for Jesus.
That night she fled and just followed the North Star, and very quickly the local paper printed a reward notice.
Moonwalk back to freedom, gonna ski to the promised land.
She headed for an area with strong groups of Quakers and anti-slavery campaigners and met a white woman who gave her the addresses of safe houses where she'd be put up. This was her first encounter with what was known as the Underground Railroad. Hundreds of people ran this network, speaking in code and hooting like owls to signify to colleagues that there was an escapee in the vicinity who needed protecting.
Excuse me, guys. Talk amongst yourselves. Keep on thinking, yeah?
Fugitives slept through the day, either in a supporter's house or in a hollowed-out tree, and headed north at night. But where north was best to head? Shortly after Harriet's escape, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This meant that even if a slave ran to a non-slave state, if the owner found them, then he could go to court and get his property back.
Ah, madam. Lost a slave, have we?
So after this act, Harriet moved to Canada, and while she was there, she found out that the new owners of her old plantation were planning to sell her niece, which meant that she'd be lost to the deep south. So Harriet decided to go back to her home, back past all the places where there was a reward for her recapture, and back to her old plantation. From there, she arranged for a boat to swing by at a pre-arranged point on the day that her niece was due to be taken to auction to be traded. Then, as the auctioneer went to lunch, the boat came by and Harriet bundled her niece away. And it must have been tempting to wait until the auctioneer was almost back and then go, Oi, mate! Going! Gone! Harriet was also learning new tricks now, such as how to tell the direction from the condition of the moss. She always took opium and a gun on her raids. The opium was to give to children to keep them quiet if they started crying, and the gun was to threaten any fugitive who lost his bottle and announced that he was going back home. So one account of her appearance as she set off on a raid was...
She was wearing a bandana on her head, a pistol on her hip, and a rifle in her hand.
Her colleague wrote...
When a member of her party became exhausted, declaring they could not go on, they would insist on returning. The revolver would then be pointed at their heads as she'd say,
Dad, you tell no tales. You go on or you die.
In one escape,
They came across a cabin of colored people who dried them out. Harriet had no money, so gave them some of her underclothings to pay for their kindness.
in areas like here, Syracuse, in upstate New York on the way to Canada, she got to know all the station masters, as they were called, on the Underground Railroad. Now, there is a school of thought that she might have been better off going south to Mexico, as this would have meant we could have made the programme there, instead of here in the pissing rain in Syracuse. In any case, soon after she got her niece to Canada, she then went back to her old plantation to rescue her brothers and her husband. But this time, one bit went wrong. She sent word to her husband to tell him the best place to meet her, but he sent a message back saying he wasn't coming as he'd married somebody else.
P.S. I've saved you some cake. Motherfucker.
Now she had no reason not to dedicate her whole life to freeing slaves. It was as if she'd taken a conscious decision that she'd suffered her last indignity. And that's how she lived for the next several years, travelling backwards and forwards from Maryland to Canada, getting slaves to escape. The reward for her capture went up to $1,200, and she became known amongst the slaves as Moses. And because on her wanted posters it said that she was illiterate, when she was on a train she would always hold a book. And once she heard a conversation between two Southerners who said, "Well, no, that can't be her, because Harriet Tubman can't read." Once, when she had toothache, afraid that it might make her scream and give herself away, she knocked out the bad tooth with a lump of iron.
I'm having so much trouble with those toothache blues.
But she carried out 19 armed raids, always getting her people out through either Delaware or Maryland, and then up to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, New York, to the suspension bridge at Niagara Falls, and then across into Canada. And on the last day of each mission, the fugitives would get increasingly tense as they sensed they just had to get through this last few hours before crossing into freedom. Harriet described one escapee, Joe, who, as he crossed the bridge, held his head in his hands and fell utterly silent, and Harriet's friend said,
In vain she tried to call his attention to the glory of the falls.
Say cheese, Joe.
But when Joe arrived in Canada, Harriet said,
He sprang to his feet and clapped his hands in perfect delirium, shouting as if he were crazy.
No more auction block for me.
She succeeded in rescuing her ageing parents with a special wagon which she manoeuvred from the plantation to New York. I know she loved her parents, but wasn't that showing off? Extreme rescuing. In between raids, she would speak at abolition rallies. But one day, when she was due to speak, she noticed that there was a court case involving an escaped slave called Charles Nally, who'd been traced by his slaveholder who was preparing to take him back to the plantations. So Harriet organised a demonstration outside the court while she slipped inside, disguised as an old woman. When the judge ordered Nally to be returned as a slave, Harriet dived across the courtroom and grabbed hold of Nally, where she went to throw him out of the window because the crowd below was preparing to catch him. But the guards got to Nally first and handcuffed him. So Harriet just clung on, and one eyewitness said,
She was repeatedly beaten over the head with policemen's clubs, but never released her hold.
Eventually, Nally was bundled into the judge's office, but 400 abolitionists broke the door down and they dragged him away and put him on a train bound for the West. Yet when I was done for shoplifting, Dartford Magistrates Court, 1976, nothing. Incidents like this transformed the northern states, and the Tribune said,
There has developed a more intense anti-slavery spirit than ever known before.
But the most spectacular of all the abolitionists was a white farmer from Kansas called John Brown.
Brothers and sisters, I'm here to tell you so today.
He was a Presbyterian who preached that slavery should be physically overthrown because it wasn't just a crime against humanity, but a crime against God.
For an abomination against the good Lord Almighty himself.
He certainly inspired support for the abolition of slavery. With some of his sons, he marched into the town of Osawatomie Creek and he killed 5 slave owners with a sword. He then planned a much bigger attack on the slave owners of the town of Harper's Ferry, and he enlisted Harriet Tubman for support. Harriet spent the summer recruiting for Brown's plans, but when the date of the attack was suddenly announced, she was in bed, unable to move because of her head injury.
Couldn't wake you, gone to overthrow slavery. Back in 5 minutes.
The attack was a disaster. Brown was captured and executed. But the reaction to his execution was extraordinary. Across the north, people were horrified, while in the south they rejoiced. There was probably a special edition of Southern Crime Watch that went, "Obviously the execution of John Brown is very, very good news, though we would warn the public that his soul could go marching on." Tensions between the North and the South grew, and then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. At first, he was seen as quite a weedy figure. For example, he couldn't make his inaugural speech because he'd lost his satchel with his notes in. But also, although he was anti-slavery, he still made comments such as,
"Just because I do not want a Negro woman to be a slave, don't mean I want one for a wife." Where's me notes?
Even so, the southern states were horrified at the prospect of being governed by a president who was opposed to slavery, and they decided to break away from America, calling themselves the Confederates, and soon after the Civil War began. At first, Lincoln and most northern leaders saw the main aim of the war as simply to prevent the southern states from forming a breakaway nation. They were much less interested in the issue of slavery. To start with, black soldiers weren't even allowed to join the Northern Army, and one northern general said,
"They should keep out. This is a white man's war."
Harriet dictated a letter to Abraham Lincoln about his attitude and was told that she could visit him, but said she'd prefer to see his wife. You wouldn't want to try that with the Blairs. You'd have a 5-minute meeting with Cherie and be handed a bill for 30,000 quid.
I know I am in a very special position. I'm the wife of the Prime Minister.
Harriet started the war as a nurse caring for northern soldiers. More and more black people were forcing their way into the war. To start with, they used their local information to be spies for the Northern Army, and General Mitchell wrote to Lincoln,
"It is of absolute necessity we protect slaves who furnish us with valuable information. Without the assistance of Negroes, I would have to abandon my position."
In the Northern Army, we appreciate the importance of a little...
Similar accounts came from every camp. For example, in Fredericksburg, a runaway slave called Dabney was employed by the Northern Army as a cook. But each day he would tell the commanders precisely where the southern troops would be marching the next day. And every day he was exactly right. Eventually, General Hooker started acting on Dabney's advice. And so every day for the next few weeks, the Southern Army was continually ambushed, utterly bemused as to how Hooker's troops knew in advance exactly where they'd be. Dabney refused to tell how he got his information, until one day when he took General Hooker up to a hill where there was a clear view of Fredericksburg, and he pointed out a cabin by the riverbank where clothes were hanging out to dry. And according to Hooker's account, Dabney said,
"My wife washes for their officers, and as soon as she hears about any movement, she moves the clothes. The grey shirt stands for General Longstreet, the red shirt is for Stonewall Jackson, and the two blankets together means ignore the movements of General Lee. They're just a decoy."
It's a good job there wasn't one of those perverts around who likes nicking stuff off washing lines. He'd have been sat at home having a wank, unaware he'd changed the course of history. Even more spectacular was the tale of William Tillman, who was a black cook on the ship the S.J. Waring, which was bound for South America from New York. En route, the ship was captured by the Southern Navy, who then killed the crew, leaving just 2 people to steer it, and Tillman, who was told that he'd be sold as a slave. So that night, he sneaked into the Southern captain's room and killed him, then killed his second-in-command and then seized the revolvers. Then he drove the Confederate crew below deck, put them in irons, released his 2 colleagues and turned the ship back to New York, where he was greeted by a crowd of thousands as a hero. During this time, Harriet was employed to operate behind enemy lines in South Carolina as a spy. For Harriet to take control in the way that she did was remarkable, given that a few years earlier she'd felt unable to eat in front of white people. The actions of former slaves transformed the war, and Lincoln changed his mind entirely and insisted on forming black regiments. The first was to be set up by Thomas Higginson, who'd been one of John Brown's co-conspirators, and his first mission was to capture the South Sea Islands off South Carolina, and he summons Harriet to be his advisor. South Carolina was the staunchest Confederate state of them all, owned by families such as the Middletons, who'd made millions from rice plantations. The plan was simply to steal as many slaves as possible in one go and then sail them up the river. Once the slaves were on board, according to one Confederate witness,
a group landed at Mr. Middleton's, and in a few minutes his buildings were in flames.
On that night, 750 slaves were rescued, and the Confederates blamed each other. According to an official report,
we allowed a parcel of Negro wretches calling themselves soldiers to march unmolested and burn a large section of the country.
Through incidents like this, the nature of the war became completely different from when it began. A Bureau of Coloured Troops was set up, and 179,000 slaves fled the plantations to fight against their former owners. Harriet changed her opinion about Lincoln. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation that abolished slavery in all territory that was captured. Sheets with the proclamation on were printed, and the first batch was taken by a black pastor to a huge platform erected for a rally. But he'd run a mile to get there, and now he was so exhausted that he had to pass the proclamation on for somebody else to read it out. The pastor said that people were so excited.
Men squealed, women fainted, dogs barked, songs were sung, and cannons was fired.
Soon after came a battle involving one of the most famous regiments in the war, the 54th Massachusetts, which is celebrated in statues such as this one in glorious, even rainier Syracuse. The 54th Massachusetts was an entirely black regiment except for the white abolitionist commander, and they were sent into one of the most daring missions in the war, the capture of a fort in Virginia. They fought spectacularly, and according to the Atlantic Monthly,
through the cannon smoke of that dark night, the manhood of the coloured race shines before eyes that would not see.
Harriet was assigned to be the regiment's nurse, although half the soldiers had been killed. Word of the battle spread across the north, and for the first time ever, the Medal of Honor was awarded to black soldiers. Ex-slaves and abolitionists now held crucial influence in the North, and Lincoln himself became a committed abolitionist. He insisted that a black regiment should capture Charleston, the capital of the Confederacy, and extract the final surrender. One account records how a black man knelt in front of Lincoln to thank him, but Lincoln replied,
"Don't kneel. You don't have to do that anymore. You must kneel to God only."
A few days after the war, Abraham Lincoln went to the theatre and was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who was connected to angry Confederates. After the war, Harriet moved back to Auburn, largely because of William Seward, the New York governor and abolitionist who'd hidden dozens of slaves here in his house. He also lent Harriet the money for her own house round the corner and didn't seem to expect repayment. She moved in with a soldier called Nelson, who was 22 years old, about half of her own age, who she'd met while he was fighting in South Carolina. Now, in the South, the period after the war was known as the Reconstruction. And during the 1870s, 15 black congressmen were elected in the South, and segregation was made illegal.
Pack up your troubles in your own kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
Now, this is quite important because it means that after the Civil War, even in the Deep South, not all white people were racist. Although it's true that things did revert back to the extent that 100 years later, in some states in the South, even black and white people's blood was kept segregated in the hospitals, which meant you must have had white people in places like Alabama going, you can't be mixing with the integration of the interracializing, putting together with the blood, because you've been running the risk of making us white folks less intelligent. The problem in the South was that the old order regrouped. The Ku Klux Klan was formed to terrorise black people back into isolation, and one victim in Baltimore was reported in a newspaper article that was forwarded to Harriet.
A coloured man named John Tubman was shot and instantly killed yesterday by a white man.
The murderer was acquitted by an all-white jury, and Harriet never mentioned her ex-husband again in public. Following his murder, she married Nelson, and for a while they lived off the proceeds of her autobiography, which she'd recited to a friend as she still hadn't learnt to write. She turned her house into a refuge centre, especially for orphaned children, but wanted to create a home for old destitute blacks, which she would call the John Brown Hall. To start with, she needed some land, so she went to auction and, she said,
I bought it for $1,450. And when asked how am I going to pay, I said I'm going home to ask Jesus for it.
Then William Stewart died. As well as mourning her friend, this also meant she had to pay back the money she owed, which turned out to be exactly the same amount as what she'd been paid for the autobiography. At one point, she couldn't pay her taxes, so she paid with a cow. Altogether, it was 30 years before she was granted a regular soldier's pension. So when the John Brown Hall for Destitutes was eventually opened, she was nearly 90 and had to move in herself.
Hey, yo, MTV! Welcome to the John Brown Hall, my crib! Check this! Nothing.
And eventually she died in 1913, the same year that Rosa Parks, the woman who started the civil rights movement when she refused to sit at the back of the bus, was born. Now she's a celebrated figure throughout much of America, although she never won round everybody. In the 1990s, Lynn Cheney, wife of the Vice President, made an official complaint about Harriet's name being taught in schools, saying that this was due to political correctness. If she'd been alive during the Civil War, she'd have been a phone-in host.
And what about this latest plan, dreamed up in some town hall somewhere to abolish slavery, huh? Now you can't even whip your own property. What is going on? Give us a call.
More common are these people who love Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Muhammad Ali and say, oh, wasn't it dreadful that people used to say that blacks were lazy and filthy and dirty? And wasn't it appalling that they used to say that the Irish were lazy and filthy and dirty? When now we know that it's asylum seekers who are filthy, sponging, disease-spreading mongrels. Do you know there's 30 million of them coming next week? The story of Harriet Tubman is the tale of a woman who fought against an axis of evil to strike a blow for freedom. She would tell the slaves that she was helping to escape, if you're tired, keep going. If you're scared, keep going. If you're hungry, keep going. If you want to taste freedom, keep going. But she wasn't just someone who helped slaves to escape. She also showed that people who are kept as far down as possible, so that they don't even own their own bodies, can still change the world. To the extent that one ex-slave, on the day of emancipation, addressed a Northern Army camp by saying,
Once the time was I cried all night. The next morning my child was to be sold, and she was sold, and I never expect to see her till the day of judgment. Now, no more of that, no more of that. With my hands I was going to work when my overseer whipped me along. Now, no more of that. They can't sell my wife and child no more. We're free now. Bless the Lord.
Oh, what a lovely, precious dream. To be young, instead of black. Open your heart to what I mean. The whole world you know.
If you fancy emancipating yourself from mental slavery, why not log on to open2.net?